The United Nations chief has warned of a global food crisis which has been exacerbated as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres delivered the stark warning at a ministerial meeting this week, in which he declared global hunger levels are at a new high. The number of people facing severe food insecurity has doubled in just 2 years, from 135 million before the pandemic to 276 million today, according to Guterres. The Secretary-General also said the number of people living in outright famine conditions has increased by more than 500% since 2016. The war in Ukraine has greatly exacerbated a pre-existing problem, as Russia and Ukraine are responsible for producing an incredibly quantity of vital grain and cooking oils, as well as fertilizers used to bolster food production worldwide. Guterres confirmed he was engaged in intense contacts with Russia and other key countries and is hopeful of an agreement to ease the problem, but solemnly announced there is still a long way to go before the issues can be resolved. The UN Secretary-General said the potential agreement he is working on would theoretically allow for the export of tons of grain stored in Ukrainian ports, and would also ensure Russian food and fertilizer have unrestricted access to global markets. The complex security, economic and financial implications require goodwill on all sides for a package deal to be reached, he said of his discussions with Moscow, Ukraine, Turkey, the US, the EU and others. I will not go into details because public statements could undermine the chances of success. He said Ukraine and Russia together produce almost a third of the world's wheat and barley and half of its sunflower oil, while Russia and its ally Belarus are the world's number 2 and 3 producers of potash, a key ingredient of fertilizer. There is no effective solution to the food crisis without reintegrating Ukraine's food production, as well as the food and fertilizer produced by Russia and Belarus, into world markets, despite the war, he said. The Secretary-General said Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24 is amplifying and accelerating the drivers of food insecurity and global hunger, climate change, COVID-19 and inequality. The conflict has closed Ukraine's Black Sea ports, halting food exports to many developing countries which rely on imports of staple foods from abroad. Guterres said that during a recent visit to Africa's Sahel region, he met families who did not know where their next meal was coming from. This is not just about Ukraine, he said. This is about the poorest of the poor around the world who are on the brink of starvation as we speak. So I ask, Russian President Vladimir Putin, if you have any heart at all, to please open these ports, so that we can feed the poorest of the poor and avert famine, as we have done in the past, when nations in this room have stepped up together. In the face of the crisis, described by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken as the greatest global food security crisis of our time, the U.S. Treasury and several global development banks announced a multi-billion-dollar financing plan to prevent starvation prompted by the war, rising food costs and climate damage to crops. Tens of billions would be spent on supporting farmers, addressing the fertilizer supply crisis, and developing land for food production, among other issues. The Asian Development Bank would contribute funds to feeding Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, and the African Development Bank would use $1.5 billion (1.2 billion pounds) to assist 20 million African farmers, according to the U.S. Treasury. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Inter-American Development Bank, the International Fund for Agricultural Development and the World Bank would also contribute tens of billions in the coming months and years to support food producers and address supply shortage issues. The plan stems from a meeting that U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen convened in April at the International Monetary Fund and World Bank spring meetings, where the looming food crisis was first addressed alongside rising energy prices. While European nations plan to phase out of Russian oil and gas, the U.S. is pressing EU leaders to consider possible oil tariffs and other methods of preventing Russia from benefiting from increased energy prices.